What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another video, and in today's video we're going to be talking about The Other Fellow. Directed by Matthew Bauer and edited by Leslie Pozzo, The Other Fellow is a documentary that focuses on a bunch of people that just so happen to share the same name as one of the most popular characters of all time, James Bond. So before we get too far into this, I just want to take a quick moment and say a big thank you over to those beautiful people over at Gravitas Ventures for sending me over another early screener to talk to you guys about. And today is a movie called The Other Fellow, a documentary that I was really interested in the second they sent me the email about this movie. This is a documentary that literally just focuses on a good set of people that all have the name James Bond, and it just kind of focuses on how that has both been a curse and a blessing in their life. And of course I won't get into spoilers of what happens in this documentary, but when it started I thought, oh wow, this is a nice lighthearted fun thing. You know, here's these people that are all named James Bond. People typically don't believe that their name is James Bond. You know, there's the funny side of it, people trying to get them to say quotes that James Bond would say, people trying to say those quotes to them themselves or expecting certain things from them because their name is James Bond. And on that level, it was pretty silly. But what was really interesting to me about this documentary as it unfolded was some of the downsides to having the name James Bond, specifically maybe things like being pulled over by a cop and telling them that your name is James Bond and not having your ID on you. Pretty much they're going to think you're lying. They're going to think you're being sarcastic. And I thought that was really interesting as we dive deeper into all of these people's lives. Some people ending up getting arrested, some people changing their names to James Bond to run away from people that they're hiding from. Some people who have changed their name from James Bond because they found it hard to even live their life with their name being James Bond. Overall, I thought it was really interesting. I thought this was a really well-paced, really well-made documentary. And I just wanted to talk about it here on the channel. More often than not, I'm talking about scripted films that have, you know, big over-the-top cinematography and performances and different things like that I can critique. But it's always great when I can see a cool documentary that I could just sit here and talk to you guys about. This film actually comes out later this week on February 17th and will be available in select theaters as well as on VOD for anybody to rent and purchase and all of that jazz. And this is a movie that has been rolling out in select film festivals since 2022. Got a release, I believe, in Australia at the very tail end of 2022, but it's starting to get its wider release over the course now of 2023, now coming here to the United States on February 17th. I got to check it out a little bit early before that release, so again, a big thanks to those people at Gravitas Ventures. So some people may consider this a 2022 release because it started having those screenings at festivals back then and officially released in Australia, but since it's getting majority of its release widely and here in the States where I'm from this year, I'm going to count it as a 2023 film. So for anybody who's curious, that's why I put 2023 in the title. But yeah, this is a movie I do highly recommend. I think if you're a fan of James Bond, the 007 movies, there's a lot to enjoy about this. There's definitely some funny moments about this and some really interesting things about this as well. This is a very well-paced documentary. You know, documentaries can go a lot of different ways. You can have some that are really informative but can be wildly boring. You can have some that are really exciting to watch, but maybe the information isn't all there. And I think that for the most part, this one did a really good job of having a nice balance of being entertaining, funny, light, and serious, while also being jam-packed with information, because outside of just focusing on individuals who, you know, have to deal with the life led by having the name James Bond, it's also a documentary that gives us some history on where the name James Bond came from, where the original writer of James Bond, Ian Fleming, took that name, and how that influenced certain things over the course of time. And I thought what was really interesting as well is that as we're introduced to these various James Bonds over the course of the film and hearing their story, instead of just sitting there hearing their story, they actually have reenactments that are intercut throughout the course of their story to give us a little bit of something that's a little bit cinematic throughout. So I thought for the most part this film was really interesting because not only is it a documentary, but it also has these scripted parts that are telling us what we're hearing from the real people who are telling us their stories. And again, I thought it was really awesome that you could have something that talks about the silly elements of Beloved that talks about, you know, maybe the annoying elements for these people as they just try to walk around. They meet somebody, their name's James Bond. People don't believe them. Again, people want them to say these quotes. People want them to be, you know, really silly or, you know, put their hands up like a gun. There's even a guy in here that changed his name to James Bond because he wanted to be James Bond and runs a James Bond museum. And so it's really interesting to see how the persona and the name of James Bond was so different for so many different people. You know, like I said before, there was an individual and many individuals who talked about the fact that they were pulled over and they didn't have their ID and they told the police officer their name was James Bond, and that caused trouble for them, even though that was their name. And so I think overall, if you're a fan of James Bond, if you're a fan of really interesting different documentaries, there's a lot of fun to be had here. If I had to say anything was a negative for me in this, there were a couple of times where I found myself slightly bored simply because they maybe reused certain lines that people had already said earlier in the film. Kind of felt some moments of the film were maybe a little bit redundant. We were kind of regurgitating some of the same things, but that's a fairly minor gripe, as I found that majority of this was new and different. And as we go from the different people and hear their different stories, everybody had a completely different approach, a different angle, and a whole different perspective on the name James Bond. For some of them, it was a life-saving situation. For some of them, it was a big hassle to the point that they changed their name. And for some of them, they just kind of lived with it, but it wasn't something they were thrilled about. It was really interesting to hear all these different stories. And again, I think the editing from Leslie Pazzo is part of what kept this film really engaging and enticing to watch, as well as those reenactments that are intercut with the stories that we're hearing. So I won't waste any more of your guys' time. That's all I got to say on this one. The Other Fellow comes out later this week in the US on February 17th. I highly recommend it. I think if you're a fan of documentaries, it's definitely one to check out at some point. In the world where there's a lot of documentaries that can be very boring and just kind of feel like, why did I watch that? I think The Other Fellow is a really fun and interesting one that also has a lot of information behind it that makes it more engaging to watch throughout. I was never really bored outside of those small moments where I felt like we were kind of feeling a bit of a redundancy in some of the stuff they were talking about. But outside of that minor gripe, I think it's definitely worth your time. I think it's a solid documentary, and I think James Bond fans are going to have a lot of fun. So big thanks to you guys for watching. Hit that like button, comment your thoughts, subscribe for more videos, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.